Livia, a stunning and compassionate nurse, had come to George's home today at his request. His uncle, Wilson, had fallen seriously ill. The doctor had informed George and his family that Wilson needed constant attention and care around the clock. That's why George asked Livia to come along, not only because of her grace and charm, but also because she was incredibly competent at her job. Soon after arriving, Livia was led straight into Wilson's room. Wilson's condition was critical, so once Livia entered, the rest of the family stepped out, leaving her alone to begin looking after him with great dedication. Now, here's how Wilson ended up in this state. Every week, he visited his late wife's grave to leave fresh flowers, but during one such visit, he suffered a heart attack. It was the groundskeeper at the cemetery who called Wilson's family for help. As George and James rushed to the hospital, they found Wilson repeatedly bringing up the woman working at the cemetery. George instantly suspected that his uncle's intentions weren't just about grieving. Wilson had a reputation for being rather inappropriate. And George's instincts turned out to be correct. The woman later revealed that Wilson's visits weren't just about paying respects. He came weekly to spend time with her under the pretense of bringing flowers. The doctor later confirmed that Wilson's stroke had been triggered by overexcitement. Though he was now stable, another similar incident could cost him his life. Seeing Wilson in such fragile condition, his grandson Roy was in tears. But not everyone was concerned about Wilson's well-being. Wilson had no children of his own, so his extended family, nieces, nephews, and their children had been living with him, all quietly waiting for his demise to inherit his wealth. After the doctor's warning, some in the family began to consider more drastic actions. They knew Wilson was still emotionally reactive, especially around women. They devised a twisted plan to use Livia's presence to subtly provoke Wilson, hoping it would push him over the edge. They counted on her charm, believing that just a glance from her could stir Wilson enough to cause another stroke. But despite their cruel intentions, Livia remained focused on her duties and genuinely cared for Wilson. As Wilson began recovering under her care, George grew frustrated. He approached Livia and urged her to stimulate Wilson in order to bring him to a dangerously excited state. But Livia firmly declined. Wilson was still too weak. George, impatient and driven by greed, tried to manipulate Livia. He began teaching her how to act flirtatiously, thinking that if Wilson saw her in a certain way, he might fully awaken, perhaps even fatally. George and James coached Livia with unsettling precision, and under pressure, she played along with some of their suggestions. It worked. Wilson eventually regained consciousness, and right away, he began behaving flirtatiously toward her. Before the situation could escalate, Roy came into the room to check on Wilson's condition. Wilson responded angrily to Roy's presence, upsetting the young man. Noticing his sadness, Livia gently brought Roy to her room to comfort him. Over time, Roy began to feel drawn to Livia, mesmerized by her beauty and kindness. And Livia, being observant, noticed this as well. The next day, while Roy was strolling around the estate, he spotted Livia swimming in the pool. Entranced, he stood watching her quietly until he heard his Uncle James approaching nearby. Startled, Roy quickly ran off before being seen. Meanwhile, James, distracted by Livia, accidentally fell into the pool. Elsewhere, George was busy on a phone call. He was making arrangements to sell Wilson's liquor business, confident that his uncle wouldn't live much longer. But his optimism was misplaced. Livia's attentive care was having a powerful effect, and Wilson was getting better each day. Despite Wilson's flirty behavior, Livia handled the situation with humor and grace. For instance, when she asked him to place a thermometer in his mouth, mischievous Wilson placed it elsewhere, hoping Livia would notice. But she laughed it off and dismissed his antics. The two shared light-hearted moments, even as the rest of the family continued pressuring Livia to end Wilson's life. Yet Livia grew more fond of Wilson during their conversations. He would share stories from his past, and sometimes ask her to read poetry he had once written for his late wife. These moments made her smile. One afternoon, Wilson quietly confided in her, "I know they're just waiting for me to die so they can grab everything I own." George, seeing his uncle recovering more and more, panicked. His scheme was crumbling. Meanwhile, Roy, searching for Livia one day, overheard a conversation between her and George. To his horror, Roy realized that George and Livia had been romantically involved for some time. George had brought her here with a dark intention to use her influence to help bring about Wilson's end. As soon as George and Livia noticed Roy spying, they tried to catch him, but Roy escaped in time. Traumatized by what he had witnessed, Roy became severely ill with a high fever. His mother tried to care for him, but his condition worsened. Seeing this, George and Livia were shaken. Outside the house, they discussed what might happen if Roy revealed the truth to Wilson. Livia reassured George, "Let him recover. Once he's better, I'll talk to him." Later, Livia sat with Roy, gently trying to start a conversation. But Roy turned away, unwilling to listen. Even later that night, while the whole family watched TV, Livia attempted again, but her presence only made Roy more anxious. Eventually, when Roy retreated to his room, Livia followed him, still hoping to clear things up. But Roy, upset and overwhelmed, lashed out. "You're not who you pretend to be," he said. "You're a fraud." And worse, taken aback, Livia quietly confessed, "When I found out the real reason George brought me here, I was just as shocked as you. At first, I refused to take the job, but eventually I gave in. Because if I hadn't, George would have just handed it over to someone else. So I started pretending to go along with George's plan. My main goal was to protect Wilson." After listening to Livia, Roy starts to believe her story. He even thanks her for looking after Wilson. Later, Livia tells George that she's spoken to Roy. He's not going to say a word to anyone. Wilson began moving around again. One day, while he was sitting outside with Livia, he tried to get physically close to her, but Livia gently stopped him and warned that such excitement could trigger another heart attack. When the family saw them together like that, they jumped to conclusions. They suspected something was going on between Livia and Wilson, but when they looked closer, all their suspicions fell apart. What they saw was Livia wiping dirt off Wilson's shoes. At that moment, George realized Livia was no longer useful to him, so they offered her money to leave. But Livia refused to walk away from Wilson. Secretly, she had been recording all their conversations. Wilson and Roy were listening to those recordings from the other room. Until then, Wilson only had a feeling that his relatives were plotting against him. But now, he was absolutely sure. After hearing the truth from Livia, George was furious and tried to take drastic action. But his siblings managed to calm him down before things got out of hand. For Wilson, learning the truth about his own family was devastating. Without wasting a moment, he threw them all out of his home. He wanted Roy to stay with him, but Roy couldn't imagine being separated from his parents. So, he left too. Moved by Livia's loyalty, Wilson eventually married her. He took her abroad for a vacation. The two of them had a wonderful time. Wilson took her to scenic spots, fine restaurants, and treated her with great care. Even though he was feeling better, Livia still looked after him as if he was still recovering. Overjoyed by her dedication, Wilson transferred all of his wealth into her name. When they checked into a hotel, Livia booked just one room, but she made sure it had 2 separate beds. She didn't want Wilson to get too close to her because excitement could trigger another stroke, and it could be fatal. Wilson respected her concerns and agreed. One night, Livia was fast asleep. Wilson watched her from his bed, and emotions surged within him. He couldn't help himself and slowly moved closer to her. As he did, his heart started racing, and then, in that moment, he suffered a stroke and passed away. By the end of the story, all of Wilson's property legally passed to Livia, and with that, the story comes to a close.